Well, welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about growing food at home in these uncertain times. And the reason I think we all know they're uncertain is, we're in the middle of a pandemic at the moment, but that's not the only thing that creates uncertainty. Weather and other factors can introduce uncertainty to our food supply. Why grow food at home? Well, it's a complex question, and really, it's been hard to try and put this particular presentation together because it covers so many aspects of our day-to-day lives, such as time, the amount of commitment we can give a garden, the financial resources that might be available, your personal philosophy, whether you're a completely organic gardener, a semi-organic gardener, or a non-organic gardener, the amount of space you have, as well as many others. In this presentation, we hope to give you some hypothetical food for thought, but ultimately the choice of what you do and how you determine how you're going to make an impact on your food at home is entirely up to you. Food insecurity is a big word these days, and there are a number of particular causes. At the moment, one of the main ones is unemployment due to the pandemic or underemployment. And this results in stretched finances for many families. Increasingly as well, urbanization has given us a loss of the family gardening traditions. When many people at the turn of the century still lived on farms, access to food was very easy. Now with increasing urbanization, many people live in what are termed food deserts, where there's high concentrations of people, but not really a lot of access to fresh food. In some cases, like the really big cities like Chicago, some areas may only have access to the equivalent of 7-Eleven stores for fresh produce, which isn't much. Increasingly as well, large agriculture is concentrating on fewer and fewer varieties. And that leaves us open to crop disease or failure due to large monocultures. And lastly, there are climate's impacts on centralized food production. For example, if we had a really bad drought in California, that would impact things like lettuce and other greens. Storms in Iowa would impact the supply of corn and soybeans, which go into just about anything you buy in the supermarket. And then, of course, we just had the snow in Texas. And if you watch the news, you can see how quickly the supermarket shelves actually emptied under those conditions when you have a real natural disaster going on. So what can you do? Well, if your finances are stretched, you can certainly visit food banks where possible. But at the moment, I don't know how many of you have been around the food banks, but the lines are pretty long. There's a lot of people looking for food. You can buy your food carefully and try and stretch your food dollar as far as you can by looking for what's on sale. Some stores may offer a cheap source of slightly overripe produce or slightly ugly produce. If you have the finances, you could also consider joining something like a community supported agriculture program or CSA. That means you're at least going to get a delivery of fresh produce every month. One activity you might want to try in the fall, if the pandemic is still with us, is gleaning with your kids for a day out. It gives them something different to do, and you get something to take home at the end of the day. More importantly, at the moment, you could join a community garden, and there's several reasons for doing that. Not only would you be growing your own food, but there's also a sense of community within the garden. And it's a great place for a beginner gardener to learn the ropes. How to garden and get the benefit of other gardeners and their expertise. Lastly, you could grow a proportion of your own food to supplement your food budget and try to get the best return on the money spent. And this is really the focus of this presentation. Why would you want to grow food at home? Well, at the moment, I think because a lot of things in life are uncertainty, it might give you a sense of security that if the worst happens, there's always something outside you can eat. And it's also an activity that gives you some sense of control over things. I think many people at the moment seem to have lost the feeling that they have control over, a lot of things in their life. It's a good form of exercise. It gets you outside in the fresh air. And if you're gardening at home and alone, you probably don't need to wear a mask as well. You can save money depending on what you grow and how you grow it, and we'll get into that in more detail. Generally, homegrown produce is at least as good quality as the stuff you get in the supermarkets, frequently better. And it's probably a little bit more nutritious. It's said that over the past 4 decades, the nutritional quality of a lot of the commercially available food has dropped by about 30%. So that's something to consider too. It's probably a good way to fill in the voids of in your pandemic day when you're not Zooming or looking after the kids or watching them do homework. It's also an excellent way to distract the children and get them involved in it. As Master Gardeners, one of the most successful programs we have is the Youth Enrichment Program, where we go around schools and teach kids about gardening, and the kids really seem to adapt to that really well. Growing your food at home and gardening in general gives you pleasure and a sense of accomplishment. In a way as well, it reflects back to a return to seasonal eating. I think today we're too used to wanting any kind of vegetable or fruit at any time of the year, regardless of where you live. When I was growing up in Scotland, I know in the 50s and 60s, there wasn't a whole load of fruit around in the winter. There's a lot of root vegetables, and people were used to eating along with what was available during the season. And as well as that, gardening and growing your food at home is a very popular activity. One thing that happened last year and is continuing through this year is seed sales have gone through the roof. I was on one website on Monday looking for a particular variety of cabbage, and all I kept hitting was sold out, sold out, sold out. So the seeds are still flying off the shelves. A lot of people are getting into this in a big way. Historically, in the past, people who worked in the land were allocated small plots to provide food for themselves. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I said we've lost a lot of our gardening traditions. In Scotland, tenant farmers were given what's called a kale yard where they could grow food for themselves. And in the south, a lot of sharecroppers and people also had land set aside for them to grow some food. In the 20th century, during the World Wars, the general population was encouraged to grow food at home to allow more food to be sent to the troops who were fighting. And this gave rise to the so-called victory gardens, or dig for victory, depending where you were brought up. In Britain during World War II, every scrap of vacant land was used to grow food. And that trend continued in the post-war into the development of many community gardens and allotments. And it's still a very popular pastime in Europe. Now, there are a number of factors to consider when you're thinking about growing vegetables at home. The first one is time. Do you have enough time to commit to tending a garden? Probably at the moment you do if you're working from home. When you go back to work, will you still have the same time to commit? That's an open question at the moment. Then there's the question of space. How much space could you utilize at your home? And we'll get into that in a lot more detail. There is also the cost. Growing food at home is not a free option. There is some cost involved, but we can lower the cost and make it generally available for most people. And what to grow? There's lots of choices here, but in general, for this area where we have a relatively short growing season, you want to pick varieties with the lowest number of days to maturity to get a quick turnaround and harvest. Then you have to make the decision of when are you going to grow food at home? Are you just going to do it during the spring and summer, or are you going to try for all year round? In terms of time, one thing to ask yourself is, do you or your children have the spare time to tend a food garden? Hopefully so. You will need to allocate time to prepare and maintain the garden. at least 1, possibly 2 hours per week, depending on the size of the garden that you're planning. You will need to weed. There's no way around that. It's always a chore, and like the poor in taxes, weeds are always with us. In summer, you may need additional time to water your plants, especially around the Squim area, perhaps not so much in PA, where they get twice as much rain as we do in Squim. And year-round gardening means you'll need to allocate more time throughout the year. Available space. You can grow food at home regardless of space, even if it's just a few herbs on a windowsill. But in general, we're going to consider medium to large size gardens in this presentation. You need to think, is there an unproductive area you could convert into a food garden, should you so desire? Perhaps a lawn that only experiences low use and is otherwise, a chore to cut during the summer and could be used for better things. Smaller areas such as windowsills, patios, containers are going to be dealt with in 2 later presentations this year. The Green Thumb presentation on May the 13th will consider growing food in containers, and the Green Thumb on June the 10th will consider food gardening in small city lots. So we're not really going to cover those in much detail. Around this area where the soils can change dramatically in a short space, and there are lots of rocks, especially where I live in the floodplain of the Dunge Ness, so basically I live on a rock pile interspersed with sand. So one of the most reasonable ways to grow vegetables is raised beds. And raised beds needn't be expensive. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see one where the bed is actually contained by some sort of structure. It could be wood, it could be brick, it could be hay bales, it could be any number of things. But it doesn't need to be that expensive or that complicated. You can simply heap dirt into a raised bed, and in so doing, create pathways between the 2 different raised beds. And that's really a low-cost option. The main advantage of raised beds is you have a deeper level of soil to work with. It warms up quickly in spring. It's relatively easy to maintain as long as it's not too wide. About 4 feet is about the widest you want to try and make it. And beds of about 10 feet by 4 feet are ideal. And the reason I chose that size is that a lot of the recommendations I'm going to suggest to you are based on beds where the rows are 10 feet long. And 4 feet is an ideal width because you can reach into the bed from either side without straining. Cost is always an issue, particularly at the moment. If you're unemployed or underemployed and you want to get into gardening, you want to try and get the biggest bang for your buck. So things to consider. Are you just interested in saving money? You have to factor in additional costs such as water, fertilizer, soil amendments, and by that I mean some form of organic matter, fertilizer, perhaps some lime, things like that. How does the cost and quality of the homegrown produce compare with supermarket prices? Another factor. Determine the relative cost of seeds for direct sowing and also the costs of growing or purchasing starts. And another thing to factor is how much would I need for my family if I wanted to go the whole hog and make myself self-sufficient, or somewhere in between, perhaps just produce a little food or 50% or 10%, whatever you decide. In terms of cost considerations, WSU has produced a very excellent little bulletin called Home Vegetable Gardens. It's at the bottom of the page here, and I'll refer to it later. If you Google EM057E, you will get it and you can download it for free from WSU website. These are the relatively high monetary value crops you can grow at home and probably save money on. A number of them don't have a great availability actually in the supermarkets. Things like leeks, I'll talk about that later. But things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, which tend to be seasonal in the supermarkets, peppers, summer squash, cucumbers, tomatoes, again seasonal, and things like shallots. You would be surprised. I think it was last year, for the first time, I saw a pound of shallots go over $6 a pound. Now, that's a considerable amount of money when you consider you can buy a pound of shallots for about, I think about $10 or $15. And each shallot will produce between 6 and 8 bulbs. So it's a good return on your investment. What to grow? There are a number of considerations we need to look at here. One is space. Obviously, some vegetables require more space than others, and that results in a lower density of planting. Things like cabbage, Brussels sprouts, tomatoes, peppers, things like that take up much more room than, say, spinach or radishes, which you can sow at a much higher density. There's no sense in growing food your kids or you will not eat. So that should really dictate the choices in what you grow. Quantity versus price, what are the best options there? That's another thing to consider, as well as quality versus price. Growing difficulty. Some vegetables are going to require more attention than others, and this may incur higher costs if they require more fertilizer, if they require a higher degree of protection from the elements. And there are limitations in your soil. Your soil may not be the best for vegetable growing. If you can afford it, the easiest way around this is to get a soil test done and then add amendments such as organic matter, lime, manures, fertilizers based on the results. You can get a soil test done for about $20. However, at the moment, the Conservation District in Port Angeles is not accepting samples for soil testing. If you go onto their website, it will direct you as to how to take the sample, how to package it, and where to ship it. It's a laboratory in Oregon. But at the moment, because of the pandemic, our local outlet we normally use for soil testing is not available. So you'll have to post it yourself. More considerations on growing, space versus yield. Some vegetables generate more in a given space than others. For example, in the room it takes for one potato plant to grow, you would probably not get as much yield if you grew, say, lettuce or radishes or spinach or some kind of leafy green. Onions are another example of that. But in general, the crops which produce a high yield in a relatively small space are relatively cheap. Potatoes and onions are good examples of that. There are seasonal requirements. Some vegetables you can only grow at specific points in the year. For example, you would never try and grow tomatoes, squash, melons, things like that outside in the dead of winter. There is a seasonal cost as well. The earlier you can harvest, the more you may save versus the supermarket before the bulk commercial crops come in. And in terms of growing requirements, some vegetables will require less preparation than soil amendment, and some will require more. So again, that's another variable we need to consider. What vegetables to grow? These are ones which have low amendment demands. They require really the minimum of organic matter addition, fertilizer addition, lime, things like that. And if you note in here, peas and beans are at the top. They are very good crops to have because they produce their own fertilizer. They fix nitrogen from the air and make it available as a nitrogen fertilizer through bacteria on their roots. A lot of the kales and the chards and the beets, again, require a minimum amount of soil amendment. The same is true for sunchokes, arugula, and broccoli rab. One thing I would advise you about sunchokes, though, is If you like sunchokes, that's good. However, sunchokes are a bit like potatoes. Once you have them, you always have them. It's always very difficult to get that last little sunchoke out of the bed if you want to change it over to something else. In terms of medium soil amendment, these are crops which would need perhaps a little sprinkling of something like chicken manure, a little bit of more of lime, a little bit more of organic matter. And these are things like, and they also, in some cases, will need regular feeding, such as tomatoes and squash. Garlic, for example, uses a lot of blood meal. They usually dress in between your rows of garlic in the spring with blood meal as a nitrogen source. So again, you'd have to factor that in. Same thing with some of the other crops as well. But these generally need a little bit more than the previous slide I showed you. And then the really high demand vegetables are things like asparagus, leeks, celery, bulbing onions and shallots, kohlrabi, cauliflower. Things like spring turnip and early cabbage are in the high amendment category because you want to try and finish them off relatively early once the growth restarts in the spring. Typically, you're going to be overwintering some of these too. And asparagus, of course, is a heavy feeder as well. So when are you going to grow? Are you only going to grow in the summer and spring season? Year-round food production will need more time commitment, more amendments, and therefore higher cost. Remember that growth slows dramatically in late fall and winter, so food available will be limited until the spring. You can still get away with a lot of kale, chard, overwintering Brussels sprouts, cabbage. It's not a complete waste of time. There's a period during the winter called the Persephone period, and this year it's running from roughly October through February. That coincides with less than 10 hours of daylight and an average temperature of below 40 degrees. That means that plant growth and plant metabolism really slows down almost to stopping. As a rough guide, you can say that period extends usually from about end of October, beginning of November through Valentine's Day as a rough guide on a year-to-year basis. There are also techniques to boost food availability in given areas by intercropping, season extensions, etc. And we'll get onto that in a second. It's really a method for increasing the density and yield from a given area of the garden. Okay, the perennial question, starts versus seed sowing. While starts potentially give you an earlier harvest, they're usually only available in packs and are expensive, often 50 cents to $1 each. In the case of things like, Brussels sprouts and small tomatoes, it may even be more than that. Take, for example, a packet of lettuce seed. Paris Island costs roughly $2.95 for 100 seeds. Or if you want to go larger, $5 for 1,000. Now remember that a seed packet is not a one-year deal. Lettuce, for example, will last up to 4 years. So 100 seeds potentially could generate you 25 lettuces a year for 4 years. Some shops will sell seeds for $1 a packet or less. So don't necessarily, if you are financially stretched, stick with the seed catalogs. I know that places like Dollar Store and Swains and other places, are selling off packets of seeds pretty cheaply at the moment. Significant cost savings can be achieved as well if you successionally sow. Instead of sowing, say, a 10-foot row of lettuce all in one go, which is going to mature all at once, divide your row up into perhaps 3 sections and sow them every 2 to 3 weeks. This is a good use of space. You can get other stuff around it in the interim, and it means you're not getting a glut everything's not coming at once, and it gives you a much longer harvest period. Catch cropping or interplanting. This is where you're utilizing available space between different crops. For example, let's say you're growing peas or pole beans. Normally you have a utilizable space between the two rows. And that's a good place to plant, say, radishes or small lettuce or something relatively small. And especially if that crop matures before your peas or your beans get too big. It's also a good way of suppressing weeds between the rows and saving you some work. Successional planting is what I talked about before, and really you're staggering the harvest. A 10-foot row, for example, could be broken into 3 sections. Plant them every 2 to 3 weeks or 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the crop. This means you don't suddenly have 15 lettuces to deal with that are all mature. You can space things out. There's another technique called quick cropping, which can be utilized in the fall, which means as soon as you say lift your onions or your potatoes or your tomatoes are finished, you may be able to squeeze another crop out that's pretty fast maturing, like some of the winter lettuces, radishes, spinach, and get that harvest in before the first frost. So it's giving you some additional utilization of the space you have available.